Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Logan Albright. I'm the head writer at Free the People. We do documentary filmmaking on liberty issues, and I am a libertarian pagan. And I've been a libertarian for as long as I can remember, pretty much. But I started reading about paganism about 15 years ago, and I started seriously talking to people and practicing it about 5 years ago. And I was just struck by the similarities that I kept running into. Like, the people I would talk to in the paganism movement would talk and they would sound like libertarians in a lot of the things that they said. And it surprised me because a lot of them don't identify as libertarians. A lot of them tend to be more left-leaning, more kind of Democrat voters. And I was surprised by that. And I started delving into it a little bit more, and I found that I really think that there's this symbiosis, this great kind of compatibility between the spirituality system of paganism and the political philosophy of libertarianism. So I wanted to have this talk to kind of explore that and talk to you guys about it and see what you think. And I have Devin Rogers here from the Spiritual Village from New Vinland as well, and he's going to talk to me as well. And Devin, why don't you just introduce yourself to the nice people?
Yep. So I'm Devin Rogers. I'm doing the Spiritual Village here. So I was kind of grown up libertarian. My dad was libertarian, so I've known a lot about that through my life. I became true in probably my high school ages, my high school years. So when I was pretty young, so I've kind of had both philosophies for a long time. I started learning about paganism when I was young. Eventually, I went into a kindred, so I was a part of a true kindred for a period of time. True is Norse paganism, so that's kind of what that is. It has a lot of connections to libertarianism, is what I've discovered through my years. I was a part of a kindred for a period of time. I became a law speaker of that kindred after my Gothi, or my priest, passed on. Then I went on to get more involved in the true communities. Eventually found myself here in New Hampshire, and I founded a new kindred, which is called New Vinland, here in New Hampshire area. And that's kind of what spawned on Spiritual Village and all of this. So that's kind of where I am currently. And so I've kind of had a little bit of both, and I've found the same thing. I've now been in the libertarian, the Free State community, seeing a lot of, libertarians from everywhere. I saw some of the old libertarian groups, even in Indiana, and today I've found a lot of True. I've seen Truers. I've traveled to all different True groups. I've traveled to the West Coast, around the country, kind of visiting different Truers. And I find a connection between a lot of libertarian ideals and True ideals tend to interconnect. There's definitely some interesting parallels between paganism and pagan philosophy and libertarian philosophy. I've noticed that for a long time. And so I really like having this discussion, because I think this is going to be fun and very interesting to see what those connections are, and to kind of hear some ideas from other people too, especially you've kind of had some similar realizations that I've had.
Absolutely. So I think we should probably start by giving people a bit of a definition of what we're talking about when we talk about paganism, because a lot of people don't know what it is or have stereotypes about it that may not necessarily be true. It's sort of a tricky term to define because it's such a broad umbrella term. Like the root of the word is the Latin word paganus, which the Romans used as a slur against country dwellers, people who lived out in the country and hadn't converted to Christianity yet. And so it just was it meant non-Christian, basically, people who worship the old Roman pantheon of gods. In the modern context, I think it's sort of a loose confederation of folk religions that come from folk traditions from around the world. And there's lots of different ones, and I'm going to leave a lot of them out in this talk because I don't know that much about them, and that's, I apologize for that, but that's just the nature of paganism, is that it's so many different traditions kind of grouped under this term. Like you mentioned, your True, which is the Norse paganism. The group that I'm involved with is much more influenced by Wicca, which is sort of a modern conglomeration of all these different spiritual traditions, ranging from Egyptian to Jewish mysticism to European witchcraft to, Hellenic gods and goddesses. It's all kind of mashed together into one system. And so it's such an eclectic thing. And that's one of the things I think is fairly libertarian about it, is that it's very curated, it's very eclectic, it's very pluralistic, and you can kind of come up with your own version of paganism depending on your personality and your heritage or your roots or the things that you're interested in.
Yep. I would agree. I've seen a lot of diversity is something I see in both communities. A lot of different ways of doing things, different groups, and a lot of acceptance too. But I found people in both groups kind of accepting of a lot of different cultures, different ways of doing things. It seems to flow naturally within pagan communities and libertarian communities as well.
Yeah, and I should also say that one of the uniting factors of pagan beliefs is sort of a reverence for the earth and an earth-based spirituality, rather than like a sky god-based spirituality, which a lot of the other monotheistic faiths have.
Yeah, most pagan faiths, I think, are at least derived in some degree from very ancient indigenous spiritualities.
Agreed.
And indigenous ways of doing. Specifically in my tradition with True, it is really more of a Norse-directed, that's where it began, but these were always tribal faiths. There were always a lot of different ways of doing things and seeing things, and things evolved and changed as they went along. And we find that in pagan communities, you see all kinds of different flavors and ways of experiencing these things and building religions and spiritual practices around them.
I wanted to kind of start by talking about some of the ethical tenets of paganism, because it's a little bit murky, because there's no central text of any of these pagan religions. The Asatru has the Eddas, and there's some kind of legendary lore that goes along with them, but there's no equivalent of the Bible in pagan religions. There's no text that tells you what you have to do, how you have to behave. There are some guidelines, like in Wicca, there's something called the Wiccan Rede, which is the core ethical tenet of Wicca, which says, if you harm no one else, do whatever you want, basically. And you harm none, do what you will. And that seems to me an incredibly libertarian formation. It sounds like the non-aggression principle, right? As long as you're not hurting anybody else, do your thing, do whatever you want to do. And I think that's, one of the things that drew me to this was this idea that there's not a long list of commandments. There's not a long list of guidelines of things you have to do. It's basically live and let live, and you have to figure it out for yourself. Would you agree with that? Is that similar in Asatru?
I would, yes. Especially sacral text. We don't really accept sacral text in most of our traditions. Sacral text is basically saying that this text is a written down code, or it's dogmas, or something of this situation. You have to follow this thing. We really don't have that in pagan faith, and even Norse, our ancestors didn't have these things. Had a lot more to do with the tribe and the individual, finding their own, their own path that would work with the natural world.
The thing I find most interesting about that is this kind of sense of personal responsibility that comes with it, because since there's not a list of ingredients or a list of rules to follow, it's much more incumbent on the individual to come up with what they think is right and what they think the proper behavior is, and then live with that and the consequences of that. You can't just go to confession and write it off. You can't say, well, I followed the rules, so I'm good. You have to kind of evaluate everything you do personally and say, am I behaving ethically or not? And I think that is a really good way of thinking about the world, because you're forced to be responsible for your decisions. You're forced to really think through your decisions and make sure that you're behaving ethically, instead of just outsourcing it to some kind of code and like we do with the legal system. Well, it's legal, so it's fine, or it's illegal, so it's wrong. That's a cop-out. That's an easy way of thinking about morality.
Yep.
Having to evaluate it
Yep.
on your own and say, well, is this the right thing to do, or is this the wrong thing to do? I think that's such an important way of understanding ethics.
And personal responsibility, I think, is a big part of that too. I just had a talk about runes earlier today, and have them all. That's a big part of what have them all was. It's kind of a part of our lore, but really what it is this sense of common sense kinds of things that work with the rest of the world. So it's not a code that says you have to do this. It's more of these are things that work and these are things that don't work. And I feel like us as nature-based religions and earth-based religions, we look at earth, we look at nature to look for a lot of values and ethical codes as well, which is kind of very similar to some of the libertarian ideas. It has more to do with the personal responsibility of what the objective in the natural world does. There is truth to that. There is not a truth that is going to be handed down to us from the sky or from a government or from anything else. It's something that we have to decide as a community and as individuals as well.
I wanted to ask you what you think about the role of the individual in Asatru, because I heard you talk last night at the Midsummer Solstice about the ceremony you gave about individualism being important in Asatru, and I think that's true in most varieties of paganism, where I mean, they're very community focused as well. It's a lot like Porkfest. Like, if everyone cares for each other, everyone looks out for each other, but there's a sense that the individual is sovereign and that the individual, the will has to be respected. One of the things that I got into when I first started learning about paganism was some of the writings of Aleister Crowley, and he's got this saying, every man and every woman is a star, which I find very powerful and very beautiful. It respects the dignity of the individual. And, you can be part of a community, but you can also be sovereign and do your own thing. And the role of will is very important in magic and in paganism, the role of the individual will to affect the world and change things. And so in some of the books I've read about pagan ethics, they've talked about, anything that interferes with the free will is considered unethical. You don't want to, perform an act on someone that's going to stop them from exercising their true will, their free will. So I wanted to ask you about the role of the individual in Asatru.
Yeah, I find in Asatru and within a lot of pagan faiths, Asatru has a tendency of being a little bit more individualized than even some of the others. I think a lot of it does have to do with just what you said, willpower. The individual in our will is an important thing. A lot of it is about finding harmony with nature, finding harmony with ourselves. This is a big part of it. But the only way you can really do that is through yourself, and through individual rituals. Many of us speak of individual rituals, things that work on your own. Is a sense of community ritual, and you have to have some communal ritual, but again, there's not a sacral text, there's not a sacral church, there's not something specific that's going to say how you should do that, because it has a lot more to do with your relationship, with deity, with gods and with goddesses, rather than what, the nation or some kind of larger thing has to deal with. And this is one reason we're so diverse and we're so different, because there's not one right way to worship Odin. There's not one right way to honor these gods. There's lots of different ways to experience this. And some of those are personal, individual, and in private, and there are some things for community as well. But both of those are correct, though. Again, we don't have a central authority in paganism.
There's no pope.
There's no pope, no pope of Asatru. Yeah.
So, you mentioned the relationship between people and gods and goddesses, and divinity. I want to get into that a little bit, or deity, because I've been kind of a spiritual seeker my whole life. I've always been interested in spirituality. I've always been trying to find where I fit in. And it took me a really long time to find it. And one of the stumbling blocks I kept running into is I would venture into a religion, and I'd find that there was such an emphasis on obedience and authority, and you have to do what you're told. You have to unquestionably have faith. And I feel that the relationship with pagans to their deities, whatever form they may take, is not like that. It's much more of a personal relationship. There's no expectation that the deities are always going to be omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent. There's no expectation that anything that they instruct you to do, you have to do. And I think that it's a really interesting kind of contrast to a lot of the monotheistic religions, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that, especially since Asatru is such a deity-focused religion compared to I tend to think of myself as what's called a pantheist, where I identify divinity with the universe itself. The universe is divine rather than personification of that divinity in one being. And maybe the various gods and goddesses you worship are aspects of that divinity, but I tend to identify it with the universe. But my sense from the little I know about Asatru is that there's much more individualism in the gods. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of relationship with deity, maybe compared to what the monotheistic religions are like.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't believe in omnipotence, that there's an all-powerful, all-loving kind of God thing. Isn't really how we look at deity. Deity for us is really how we're relating to that deity. We also don't believe our deities are perfect. A lot of us in Asatru, it's really, we'll say things. So I really like the metaphor that the gods are more like our family. We look at the gods more like a grandfather and a grandmother. They're not perfect. They're not, everything they do isn't right. They do things that are wrong too, but they are guides, and I look at the deity as a guide. I don't look at the gods to give me a new car. I don't look at them to, make my life perfect. That's not what they're here to do, and I don't think they can. I don't think they have the ability to do that. But I do believe they have the ability to guide us,
right,
to help us become better people and show us the way to do that. And that's part of that individual relationship again, because each individual is very different. So if we're all different, the gods, how Odin's going to guide me is going to be a little different than how Odin might guide you, you know.
Yeah, you mentioned like the lack of perfection in the gods. The gods aren't perfect. They have their foibles. They have their things you have to deal with. And I think that's really a really important point to follow up on, because one of the things I love about paganism and one of the things I love about libertarianism is sort of an anti-utopian feeling in it. It's like we don't imagine that we can solve all the problems in the world. Like there's no magic bullet that solves everything. Freedom is messy, right? And that's, I think, something we all understand, that if you let people be free, there's going to be problems. There's going to be lots of problems, but it's better to do that than to try to control everything and take away people's freedom for the purpose of trying to create a utopia. And I feel that that's a spirit that is mirrored in paganism a lot, because there's no sense of like, there's no like most versions of paganism don't believe in any kind of like heaven or paradise. They believe that there's no eternal reward of perfection. It's just like life is what it is, and it's messy and it's imperfect, but it's beautiful and it's great and it's glorious, and we should have reverence for it and we should celebrate it. Is it something you would agree with?
Yes, absolutely. I feel like that's a difference in paganism, specifically to Abrahamic traditions, is we don't look at so much like, like a lot of these traditions like an apocalypse or like some kind of ultimate heaven, ultimate future, everything here goes away and everything changes. In paganism, it's more of, and that's why I say this all the time, finding harmony with nature, finding harmony with the cycles. We're very much a cyclical religion.
Yeah, definitely.
Things are a cycle, and it's finding harmony within that cycle. And you do have, in Asatru, we have Ragnarok, and in Hinduism, you have the Kali Yuga, but these are not end of the world kinds of things. They are simply part of eternal ages that are continuously cycling and moving and in motion. And really the way to what we should be looking for in life isn't for some kind of perfect utopia. It's to find balance and harmony with the life that we are living now.
I think the cycle thing is interesting and important as well, because there's a lot of observance of the seasonal cycles and the cycles of nature that the planet goes through in paganism. You have the summertime, and then you have the harvest, and then you have the winter where everything goes dormant, and there's this cycle of death and rebirth that repeats over and over again. And in a lot of ways, I feel like it's a healthier relationship with death than a lot of other people have, because we understand that you can't have birth without death. You can't have death without birth.
Yep, and that's a big part of what Asatru really is. I mean, a lot of our deities deal with just that. We have certain deities more about life and beginnings of life. We have a lot of deities, like Wuthen or the goddess Hel. Mm-hmm. These deities are really helping people to understand that essence of death. Death isn't seen as a bad thing or a negative thing. It's just part of the cycle. It's just another transition. And the same with everything. I mean, birth is a transition as well. Coming of ages, marriages, all of these things are transitions that we are going through in the cycle of our life, and it's finding a relationship and accepting those things is what we should be doing, rather than being afraid of them or being worried about them.
I think the principle of motion is also really important. And this is like, there's a book called the Kybalion, which is a kind of foundational book on occultism that lists a lot of principles that various people who practice magic or the occult are attuned to. And one of them is that everything is always in motion. There's no such thing as stasis. Everything's always moving and changing. And to me, that's like, there's a link there between the way that libertarians in particular think about markets and think about society and the economy. There's no equilibrium, right? Everything's always moving. It's always a process. Yes. Everything's always changing. And I've actually written a book on libertarian paganism, which has not been published yet. But if you own a publisher and you want to publish it, come up to see me after. Mm-hmm. But I one of the links I'm making is like the libertarian idea of how markets work and how societies work as a kind of metaphor for the way that we understand life cycles and motion and things like that.
Yeah, liberty. Most libertarians don't believe in the very static kind of thing. I think it's a big important thing with Asatru as well, and most indigenous pagan spiritualities is we don't really believe in a stagnant kind of thing. This is why we don't believe in sacral text, so things change on a regular basis. Our relationship to our gods change. What my ancestors were doing in like the Neolithic is different than the Bronze Age, and it's very different from what we do today. So we're always changing this relationship. We're working on this relationship. And it is kind of interesting that you see a similar thing with libertarians. Also don't like that idea of this static hardcore, you do this and that, or we do this this one thing forever and everything's going to be wonderful. And I think even festivals like this, this is a libertarian festival, and I see a lot of diversity here, a lot of different people doing liberty in their own way, in different ways. I don't see many people that want to follow particular kind of rules and directions. And I see the exact same thing at pagan festivals, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. And one of the other things that has attracted me to it that I find lacking in other religions is an appreciation for the material world that I find, like most other religions, whether it's Hinduism or Christianity or Buddhism, there's sort of a contempt for materialism in the material world. And it's like, actually, the spiritual world is what matters. All this is degraded and crude, and we got to get rid of this and transcend it and find enlightenment in some way. Paganism is the only faith that I've encountered that kind of celebrates the material world. And it's like, it's part of the divine, it's part of nature, it's part of God, and it's beautiful, and it's a gift that we should be grateful for. And whatever comes after, but while we're here, we should appreciate it instead of trying to shun it and hasten the end.
Yes. No, absolutely. That's one of the major connections that I found, even with reading books like Ayn Rand and all of her ideas. I've made a lot of connections with that in paganism. Because paganism, we really believe the spirit and nature are interrelated. It's interconnected. It goes right back to finding harmony with nature. We're earth-centered religions. And let's face it, all of these things come from earth, This all comes from nature. And nature is the objective world we live around. And paganism is trying to find balance and harmony with that natural world rather than trying to escape the natural world. And when you get into some of the other religions, they are trying to escape this world. Heaven is way up here for us. Heaven is harmony right here in this world. I find it very interesting that a lot of libertarians really are looking at things very similar, saying that this world isn't an evil world. We should embrace capitalism, and embrace the self, improve the self. And I find that's an interesting thing. You see a lot of libertarians say self-improvement, improve the self, be an entrepreneur, create, and you see the exact same thing in paganism. A lot of it is building the self, improving the self, making yourself into a better person. I think that's a very crucial thing that you don't see, both in a lot of mainstream religions saying that the self isn't good, selflessness, trying to escape things, and even in some government things, you tend to see a lot of this idea that you shouldn't be wealthy. Wealth is a bad thing.
Right.
The wealth should be shared. All that kind of stuff.
I wanted to ask you what you think. This is sort of an idea I've been playing around with, and I don't know where I'm going with it exactly, but I wanted to ask about what you think about the role of subjectivism in paganism and in libertarianism, because to me it seems that the role of subjectivism is sort of important. And I know there's a lot of objectivists here, and I don't want to offend any objectivists, but libertarian, Austrian understanding of economics is very subjective in a lot of ways. We believe in subjective value. Prices are the relationship of the individuals and their personal knowledge of time and place to the circumstances. There's no such thing as an objective value for an object. And in my understanding of paganism, it's also a very subjective thing because people have their own personal relationships with ideas like gods, like magic. In the group that I'm part of, which is very eclectic, there's people who have what we call hard polytheism, where they totally believe in the individual personification of these gods as real things. And then there's people who have a more metaphorical understanding of them and think of them as natural principles that we're characterizing as entities, as living beings. And some people have a more psychological understanding where it's all really in your head, but this is a way of understanding it and getting there. It depends on your relationship. And so I find that this sort of subjective approach to religion is a little bit mirrored in the libertarian subjective approach to economics. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think you tapped on something else that I've also noticed within both communities is exactly that, the subjectivity, but also the many different ways of doing things. We see the exact. It's funny, here you have a lot of these different ideas that you have, the real hardcore, the lost Brodians, like you said, the objectivists and all these different kind of things. The anarchists and the minarchists and all this. Yeah. Well, in reality, we have the exact same thing in Austin. True, we
totally.
have the Reconstructionists, and then the hard and the you have the more very subjective, more pagan kind of things. You have just all these different kinds of ways of looking at it. So I think that's part of it, and I think it comes from that subjectivity, but also I think that love for diversity and that being okay with somebody else. I can sit there, someone that's a hardcore Reconstructionist or someone that's a hardcore like pantheists, and I'm not. I'm more of a polytheist, but I'm happy to talk with pantheists. We both can kind of have a communication. We can be in the same place, just like here. You can see all these different things. We tend to get along very well, regardless of our differences. Where some communities you don't see that. Religious communities, specifically, you see them, and you don't accept the catechism, or you don't accept, law A and law C on catechism made at certain X amount of time, then you're not in our church, get out of here.
Why do you think it is that there's such a, I've just observed such a high level of tolerance and acceptance among the pagan community for different beliefs and for different types of people? And I'm not really sure why it is. It's I don't know that there's anything fundamental in the faith that would require that, but it seems to be the case. And I think it might be because it's just such a minority and there's so few of them that they're like, yeah, we'll welcome anybody who wants to join us. It's fine. And we're all weirdos, and we understand what it's like to be kind of stereotyped and persecuted, and we don't want to do that to other people. Why do you think it is?
So I think there is a degree to that, absolutely. But I do think it goes a little bit deeper, because it feel like that both the philosophies they're not grounded in universal kind of concepts, where because again, it goes back to, we don't believe that everything should be one way.
Right.
Libertarians, really, we just want to be left alone. We want to have the right to do what we want to do, rather than everybody do this one perfect thing to create the perfect pinnacle. And the same in paganism, I don't want everyone to be a Norse pagan. Norse pagan's just what works for me. If Celtic pagan works for you, or a South American pagan, or like you said, Crawley or Wicca or something like that, that's fine. There's nothing particularly evil or wrong about that. It's just something different than what I'm doing. Where I think that's a little different when you get into universal religions, and honestly, universal political idea like communism and things, where they think everyone has to be in the perfect system to create that utopia. So maybe it goes back to that utopic thinking.
And perhaps it also explains the lack of proselytizing you see in paganism.
Yes, absolutely.
Because we're not so interested in converting people, because we're not selling universal truth. We're not saying, we have it right and everyone else has it wrong, so you have to agree with us. So you don't get that much proselytizing. And there are certainly proselytizing libertarians. I've met plenty of them, but I don't think it's consistent with the philosophy. I don't think if you're a libertarian, you should be going out trying to tell everyone else you have to be a libertarian like me. I think you should respect different people's ideas and forms of thought.
And I think it's absolutely not something I see in libertarian communities either. Every once in a while you do have someone else to preach this thing or that thing, but it's not the same kind of Bible thumping kind of really radical kind of stuff. You got to see it this way. People are much more tolerant here.
And I guess one of the last things I was going to bring up on this is, one of the things that just makes me laugh and makes me have fondness and great love for both of these communities is the difficulty of corralling them, and the difficulty of putting them in a box, and just how independent-minded they are. I was reading this book called Drawing Down the Moon, which is a history of American paganism. Cool. And there's another book which is really interesting called Radical Spirits, about the spiritualist movement in America, which was a women's liberation movement essentially, but that was taking the form of communicating with spirits. And in both books they talk about how they tried to organize groups and found societies and set down bylaws, and everyone just bolted, and everyone was like, no, we're not doing that. You can't put me in an organization. You can't bind me like that. I'm an individual. I'm going to go off and do my own thing. And while it practically makes changing the world perhaps more difficult, it's awesome, and I love it, because it's the same way libertarians are. We just don't tell us what to do. Leave us alone.
And it really goes back very far into it goes very into ancient history. If you really think about it, paganism comes from very tribal, decentralized tribal religious groups. They were primarily organized in a decentralized kind of way. There were many tribes, especially for Ozatru, where we come from. When you look at Iceland, ancient Iceland, it was an actual voluntary society. There was no head government of it. It was lots of different groups, working together. And I find it very interesting that both groups really, and Ozatru today is decentralized. We're many different kindreds and many different tribes, all with different things, and we kind of work together to make things work. And I kind of have been finding the same thing with libertarianism, honestly. Neither of us are real completely structured things, and I think that gives us our power in a sense, because you can't really wipe either group out, because you can wipe out this
There's
group
no
or
head
that
to cut
one,
off, right?
Yep, no head, nothing in charge.
What else did I miss? What else do you want to talk about here? And then we'll take some questions since we finish with that.
Okay. I think you kind of hit a lot of things. I suppose the big part for me, I think that I've recognized from libertarianism and True is partially, I think, the ethics, the moral, some of the moral codes seem to be very similar with our traditions, particularly in how we deal with each other. There's infighting and stuff you can see as well, but if you really look into the deeper ideas of it, it's not so much of it's more of a getting along. It's more of like a contract kind of thing,
Yeah.
I mean, we both make contracts, we make the trade, we do all of that, and we don't really see the need of some sort of third party, telling us how to deal with these things. And I see this in our community today, and even ancient times. I think you see a lot of that similar kind of an idea.
Awesome. Well, this is a big topic, and there's it's an unfamiliar topic to a lot of people who don't know much about paganism particularly.
Yeah.
So I'd like to take some questions from the audience if anybody has any. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Anyone? Go ahead. Yeah, so the question is that maybe a lot of pagans are more leftist and not libertarian because of the environmental aspect of it and because of the tolerance and pluralism of it that have been sort of co-opted by the Democratic Party and the progressive movement, and so people are joining for that reason. I think that's definitely part of it. I also think that you always tend to have radical movements that are a little bit, oddball, tend to go to the left first because they're people who are rebelling against the establishment. And so I think that's also a large reason why a lot of people identify with the left, because they're like, well, yeah, we're different. There's a lot of LGBTQ people in the movement, in the paganism movement, and I think it's kind of natural that they would come from that direction. But there's definitely this instinct not to want to be controlled that's there as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think another aspect to that, I feel that a lot of people, specifically on the left, I think they don't want to be a part of the establishment. They see something wrong with these established older orders. They're trying to resist it. I think a lot of people coming to paganism are for the same reason. They're seeing problems with the church and all of this, so they're kind of pulling away. Something else I've noticed is a lot of even people that would identify as liberals because they don't really accept a lot of the ideas. I've seen so many people who identify as liberals are really more libertarian, but they see the uses of it. And I feel like that's something that happens a lot in paganism, very much like with Native Americans. A lot of Native Americans really have more liberty ideas, but you get a lot, I mean, if you're getting a lot of, extras from the government, it's kind of hard to rebel. Or if you're afraid, I feel a lot of pagans have, and in our history, we have actually been persecuted quite a bit, and they're afraid of that persecution. And they're afraid the right is more likely to persecute them than the left, because the left at least appears at this particular time to be more tolerant of diversity and different ideas like paganism.
I will say also on the environmentalism thing, I've been a little bit surprised with the pagans I've talked to. While there is a strong environmentalistic current in their thought, not too many people that I've talked to have been big on, like, the government has to solve this problem for me. There's a lot more personal responsibility, personal ecology kind of thinking in the movement, which I think is entirely consistent with libertarianism.
I think it's a lot more of, with pagans that I know, it's more of us taking care of the environment, not getting someone else to do it for us.
Exactly.
I think it's an important part of the practice.
And also, I will mention on the demographic angle, I don't know what it's like anymore because this book was written in the 70s, but the book I mentioned earlier, Drawing Down the Moon, the woman did a survey of American pagans, and they were all over the map in terms of political beliefs. And there were a lot of libertarians, there were a lot of anarchists, there were a few communists and socialists, she said she found one fascist, which is strange, but whatever. But like mostly they were, for the most part on the sort of liberty side of things, which I was surprised to find too. So there's probably more than we realize going around out there.
I've seen some similar numbers within True studies, and it's always hard to know how accurate some of these are, but same kind of thing, people from all across the board. I will say I have seen a higher percentage, at least within True, that are more libertarian than you definitely would in the average population.
Yeah.
So it's not a significant amount, but it's significant comparatively. We're way over, I would say, way over like 5%. This is what you see in the general population. Is much higher than that. You see a lot of libertarians.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely.
Something that might add to that, the kindred that I was in, we had only a few people, but we had a lot of, I think half of our kindred was libertarian, and I think that's pretty significant when you look at it compared to the rest of the population.
Cool. Anybody else have questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I got a question for you. So let's say you're creating an intentional community, and you're taking libertarianism and paganism as like the core parts of it. If you had to like recruit people for this community, what would you say are the core tenets of this mixture hybrid community, and why would this community thrive?
Okay, so the question is, if you were going to intentionally create a libertarian pagan community, what would be your kind of recruitment message on core principles? You want to core principles and why would it thrive? You want to take this one?
I think the core principles in that really, and I guess suppose the thing that I see in both communities would really be the voluntary agreement, and probably a voluntary agreement of something like happened in Iceland, right? You know, we all voluntarily agreed to the all thing and to the law code, you know, but the key is we voluntarily agree to that law code. It doesn't hold us, you know, and we all have the ability to escape it. So I really, you know, that Icelandic model would probably be the way to go, because it has the same kind of moral ethics to both communities, and we even have some ancient pagan history that goes along with that, just to make it better.
Yeah, I think that the most important thing for founding a community is that you agree on morals and ethics. I mean, that's something I was commenting on earlier about PorkFest, where we are now. Like, the reason this works so well, I think, is because people have the same ethics, and like everybody's getting along and nobody's stealing from each other. People just leave stuff out, and like people are leaving out coffee for people to buy whenever they want, and nobody's stealing it. Everyone's paying for it. I think it's because we have that property right ethic, and that, you know, don't hurt people and take their stuff ethic. Then I think that's kind of what you have to sell communities on. So that would be my pitch, is say, we're going to build this community where as long as you don't hurt anyone else, you can do what you want, and we accept everyone, and we're tolerant, and we're gonna, you know, let people do their own thing and worship the way that they please, and live their life the way that they please. And I think the reason you said why would it thrive, I think it would thrive because that's how all communities that thrive work. And the less centralized control you have, the more people can figure stuff out on their own and come up with solutions to problems. Anybody else? Yeah. That's an interesting question. It's like, what are the differences between a environmentally conscious atheist libertarian and a pagan libertarian? I don't know that the differences are all that broad, honestly. I think it has to do more with your personal relationship with the world. In terms of what you would see as an outside observer, I don't know that you see that much difference, because there's not a huge gap between someone who's sort of a soft polytheist or a pantheist and an atheist,
yes,
in my view. In terms of the way that they interface with the world. I think it has much more to do with the way that you experience the world, and your personal way you want to live, and your personal practice and how you worship, rather than what you would see as an outside observer. What do you think?
Yep. Yeah, I would kind of see a similar thing. Something I would add to that, even in Ozatru today, and Ozatru in ancient times to some degree too, but particularly today, is we have a lot of people what they would have called the godless, or people that didn't really have trust or belief in the gods, but they were still part of the community. There's no if they do honorable things, they do good things and all of that, there's no reason that they shouldn't be a part of our community. We never had an issue, and still to this day we don't have an issue. I mean, very few groups kick out people because they're atheists. You know, if you like us, if you like what we're doing, you enjoy the service, then come enjoy it, be a part of it. You know, it has nothing to do with your own personal beliefs. Really aren't a part of it.
Yeah, the group that I'm a part of. Sorry, go ahead. The group that I'm a part of also we did a survey of our members, and we have some people who identify as atheists in that group as well. And some people just like the ritual and the ceremony of it. They find it gives them meaning, even if they don't believe in any kind of higher power or deities or anything. And I think that's awesome. I think it's cool. Some people just like ritual.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people in Ozatru are very similar in the idea they really look at the gods as just part of the mind, you know, and part of better ways of understanding self and improving themselves. And man, if that works for you, great, you know, just because, you know, I might take a more theistic position, but that's because it works for me, you know. I mean, there's no reason that I don't think I think these things would get along great. And honestly, I have seen a lot of people in the more of the atheist or more of the psychological perspective within kindreds, and I haven't really seen an issue with them before.
Well, part of it is that we don't believe that morality necessarily comes from deity.
True. Yes.
But morality can come from anywhere within the self, and we don't believe that you have to believe a certain thing in order to be saved.
Absolutely.
So we're
That's a
very
big
welcoming
part
to
of it.
atheists, for sure. Any other questions? All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up. Oh, you have another one? Go ahead.
Another question. It relates to this, but also more. How do you measure whether your intentional community is successful? Let's say you did the libertarian paganism. How would you know? What would be your metrics of a highly successful community blended these two philosophies?
How would you measure the metrics of whether or not a community that embodies these values is successful? I don't know that you really need to measure it, but for me, I would measure it in terms of, like, are the crime rates low? Are people successful?
Mm-hmm.
Are people not living in poverty? Are people helping each other? I don't know. Like this, I feel like this is true for any kind of community. What do you think?
Yeah, I suppose the balance of the community. You know, if I look at other pagan communities, if I'm wanting to network with them, the main thing I look at, are there problems? Is there drama? Is there fights? Is there about that's the kind of thing. If everybody's happy, they're all getting along, they're all doing what they want to do, then great. I think that would be really your metric, is how well are people getting along? Are they all enjoying the time that they're there? So I guess, does that answer your question maybe? Or?
Yeah, would you make that transparent about, like, when you're creating it, as like these are the outcomes or goals we're looking for?
Well, I mean, the question assumes that we're deliberately trying to create a community like this, which I don't really have any interest in doing. I'm just like, let people do their own thing and come up with the people they want to associate with and be part of. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I guess it would depend on the type of community, and honestly, I think a community would have to decide that if one was going to build a community, and I am building my True community, and how I build that community is by saying, here's the values, here's the certain beliefs, here's what we want to do with this community, here's what we want to provide. So just so that's spelled out, everybody understands what that is, then I think that would be part of the metrics. If growth is part of it, then that would be a metric. You want to have so many new people in. If maybe you don't want growth, maybe your thing has more to do with how well you practice, or maybe you're trying to teach people a particular thing. How well am I doing a particular ritual or something? It would depend on the group. So it'd be very, very different from one group to the next.
And I would just conclude by saying, I'm not trying to, like I mentioned before, we're not proselytizing. I'm not trying to convince anybody that they should be pagan. I'm not trying to convince anybody that they should be libertarian. I just thought this overlap was interesting. And I thought there's a lot of people now that are kind of searching for meaning in their lives. And we see this a lot with like the Jordan Peterson talks and things. People are looking for meaning. And I think, we've seen that from the metrics, paganism is a very fast growing community. And I think people are looking for some kind of deeper spiritual meaning in their lives. And I wanted to kind of explain this to people who don't know what it is, so that if they are searching and they're looking for something, they may not have heard of it, and they can look into it and see if it's right for them. And if it's not right for them, that's totally cool. But I just think exposing it and being more transparent about it and letting people know what's going on is a useful thing to do. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate your time. We are going to film an episode of Matt Kibbe's podcast, The President of Free the People, with some of the members of the Mises Caucus and the Libertarian Party here soon. We're also having a happy hour at 5 with free Flying Dog beer, so feel free to stick around for that and have a beer on us. Thank you so much. And thank you, Devin, for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I like this quite a bit.